So we are basically going to do a retrospective on various types of shawl weavings in India over centuries. Shawl weaving, actually there's evidence of weaving of shawls starting from the 10th century. Even earlier there are different types of records that show that shawl weaving started much earlier. And but the primary sort of thrust that happened in the shawl industry happened during the Mughal rule, during King Akbar's time. King Akbar was the grandfather of Shah Jahan, and he built the Taj Mahal in Agra and the Red Fort here in Delhi. So a lot of the shawls were inspired by Mughal architecture, and they were also fused with a lot of the Indian architecture at that time. They used to actually import weavers, and they taught prisoners in jails how to weave carpets. And so that's when really carpet weaving and shawl weavings really sort of culminated here. There were some major centers where they made shawls. Most of the better shawls were done in Kashmir, and most people think of Jamawar shawls and associate it with Kashmir. However, there were shawls that were made in Punjab. There were shawls that were made in Jaipur, in Hyderabad, and further down south. There is a primary difference when you commission a piece of work, when you get a shawl made for yourself, as opposed to today a shawl is treated as a, it's a commercial merchandise. Whilst in those days shawls were treated as an art form, and a lot of the times these shawls were not only used at ceremonial functions for the kings to wear. A lot of them used to actually get clothes made out of them. A lot of them were used as gifts, and especially so the custom and norm was that when a well-to-do person was getting married, he would bring his wife to be a finely made Jamawar shawl. A woman that was unmarried was not normally accustomed to getting a Jamawar shawl. It was only a form where they used to do it for marriages, and then subsequently over a period of time things changed. So we are going to showcase some of the different types of weaving techniques, and these are from different periods. Generally these shawls were categorized into 4 different periods. The first period was the Mughal times, which then the Mughals came into India in the 16th century, where they actually started the shawl weaving around that time. And then you have the Afghan period and the Dogra period. For the Dogra period, there was a very famous Sikh period, which is where some of the best examples of the shawls were made. So it's not necessarily important that the pieces that were from the older periods were necessarily rarer. It was actually during the Sikh period where some of the best shawl weavings happened, because the Punjab rulers were actually fond of some of the best things in life, and they made some of the most exquisite masterpieces during that time. So a lot of this collection is from that time. This first example that we're going to look at is called a Tariq Tar Dorukha. It's an all over shawl. It's called a Purmatan. And it's called a Gulabkar. Gulabkar is like a flower, is a rose, and the idea is that these designs were all supposed to be gardens of paradise. The original Kashmiri shawls that were done in the 17th century were made in shatush, and sometimes they were blended with fine pashminas, and very few examples of those kind of shawls exist today, because 17th century is 400-500 years old, and the fiber is very delicate, so it doesn't survive very long. So there are some fragments that you can find in museums, at the Metropolitan Museum or the V&A, and there's some other good museums that have the Smithsonian. They have some very good examples of Mughal 17th century pashminas. We don't have any in our collection, so I haven't been able to pull out any, but they were, the primary method of making them was very different. And the shatush, I don't know, a lot of you may not know the difference between the shatush and the shamina or the pashmina, but the shatush comes from a Tibetan antelope, where you have to kill 3 or 4 antelopes for each shawl, and these were actually made for the kings in those days in the 17th century. And you know, historical records show that the kings used to actually have all their clothes made out of them, because they were really great for insulation. They were really warm, soft. Another quality of the shatush was that it was an aphrodisiac. So the kings used to get 3-meter or 3-yard shawls that were made, and they would wear it to bed, and they were very popular in their harems, obviously. I'm sure a lot of us would like things like that these days, but those shawls was really sort of fabulously made. The designs were very basic. They had a very plain center field with a little kani weaving border. I'll explain to you how the kani weaving is done later, and that's what is supposed to be the real Jamawar shawl. So when you make the shawl, you initially source the raw pashmina fiber, which we will show you a little example of. This is a little bit of the pashmina fiber. You can feel it and pass it around. So this fiber is basically the finest of the pashmina that you find, and this you just shear it off a sheep's back or a goat's back, and most of the time it's goat. The cashmere is a sheep, while the pashmina is a goat, and they are sort of cousins of each other. So it's a different strain and breed of raw material that one uses. So this material is hand spun and hand woven, or was hand spun and hand woven in those days. So you basically just hold a piece of fiber, and then it's manually rolled by your hand, and there's about 16-17 different processes of spinning and weaving, where you first convert the fiber into a yarn. So Mahatma Gandhi used to use the charkha, which is a very typical way of how this material was spun in by spindles by hand, and you'd spin it into a thick yarn, then make it finer, and then subsequently finer. It's a very painstaking process, and generally done by the women of the tribes, or women in those days who used to make them. And then because this fiber was very delicate, it had to be starched. So they would in order to give it strength, they'd soak rice or husk rice, and put it overnight in cold water, and you'd get it starchy, put it in starch, and then you'd sort of eventually make the shawl, and then subsequently the shawl was made on a hand loom, where I don't know if any of you have seen a hand loom work, but similar to how the saris are done in these days. They used to use hand looms to make them. So that was a different technique of weaving, and then subsequently the pashminas were washed in mountain streams, and this is also one of the secrets to good manufacturing of shawls, is that they used to tie yardages of fabric from one end to another in a river, and put it, and the gushing of the water would massage the shawl and make sure the and this was mineral water. This is not regular water that we drink in Delhi these days, but it was very good quality water, which also is an essential ingredient when you are making vegetable dyeing. When you do natural dyes or vegetable dyes, the quality of water is pretty essential to get a great quality of color, and I'll explain to you about dyes later. So this is how Mughal carpets were made, and then they had this basic kani weave border, and the kani weave is a special weave which is called a double interlock weave, and it is created by, they have these thin toothpick like or slightly larger wooden sort of sticks, where you wrap hundreds of different colors around it, of yarn around it, and then this is put on a loom, and then they create the design where you make this double interlocking weave and make small pieces of pattern where you create the design, and then that you add up a lot of these pieces together, and this could range anywhere from 300 pieces to 1500 pieces, depending on whether a shawl is a small size, a rumal which is a square size, or a large size doshalas. These shawls, as you see, are very large size pieces. These are normally 3-yard pieces, and this is the actual original size that was made. Today, so this shawl that we are showing you again after that is another, this is called a Terikdar. This is it's a Dorukhi Purmatan again, and it has an all over beetle nut pattern. You know, the beetle, we have the pan in India, and it's the beetle leaf pattern. And the difference in this is that this has a weave. All the pattern has been woven, and then on top of the pattern there is a embroidery, and the outlines have been embroidered, and the embroidery is so fine that it is called Dorukha. Dorukha means double sided, and it is fine enough to be seen from the other side. This particular shawl has been lined from the back with a net, so you can see both the front and the back, although it's a bit hazy, that's because of the net. But if you see underneath the net, you can see it's almost, you can use it from either of the two sides, and it does